Okay here? Yeah, here we go. Yeah, we're good. Yeah, so this is an example of how we are a loving community, right? We all come together. We all pray for Jack. Let's take a moment of silence now and pray for Jack that he'll be fine. And let's please keep him in mind in our prayers all week. Moment of silence, please. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. I'm going to try to get through this here, and you can pray for me along the way, too. I need all the help I can get. But thank you. Okay, she wants me to wait. Is it good? Okay, we're good. Thank you, audience, and for those of you out there who were wondering what was going on, we just had a mishap with one of our members. We got an ambulance in. He seems to be doing fine. Reverend Beth went with our Jack, who is a good, faithful member here. So we just want to let you know out there that I'm Ray Long. I'm taking over for Beth. I'm not going to do an Alexander Haig here, but I'm going to try to make it through the sermon where she was. So she was talking about the story of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery, and that it was one of the best examples she knew of how to demonstrate with few words when something is very wrong or harmful with attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Like many of you, she said she had always loved this story, and so do I. For women everywhere, it is a justice with love kind of moment. A justice with love kind of moment at a time when the rules all seem to favor the patriarchy, the men in charge. Thankfully, times have changed. According to Jewish law, women caught in adultery back then were supposed to be stoned to death, while men could quietly slip away. It's no mistake that the setting of the story is in the temple, where Jesus is teaching the people about the Jewish Torah. And he's teaching, the legal experts and the Pharisees. Those are the ones who are there. The ones in charge. Those are the ones in charge of keeping the rules. They brought a woman to Jesus who had been caught in adultery, and they placed her in the center of the gathering together, and who knows how many of them there were, but obviously there were several. They told Jesus that she had been caught, and the law of Moses required that she be stoned to death. But they wanted to know what Jesus thought. It was a test. This was a common strategy they employed for trying to get Jesus to say something that would be against the law, so that they could bring charges against him. According to the story, Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground with his finger. If you can imagine this whole scene, you can surely feel the frustration of those who were trying to trick him. They were waiting for his misstatement. They were waiting to jump on him, basically. And instead, he is silently writing on the ground with his finger. They can't wait any longer, so they keep asking him questions. After some time, Jesus finally stands up and says to them, "Whoever hasn't sinned should throw the first stone." And then he bent down again and wrote with his finger on the ground some more. One by one, beginning with the elders, they all walked away. Finally, it was just Jesus. It was just Jesus. And the woman rather, in the center of the crowd was the only one left. Jesus asked her where they were and if no one was going to condemn her. She said, "No one, sir." And then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." There are many reasons Jesus might have bent down to write on the ground with his finger. Maybe he was taking a pause, like we talked about last week. A pause. I can only imagine how tempting it would have been to just pick up the stones and throw them at these so-called righteous men. This is Beth's thought, of course. Am I the only one who thinks of Anjanette Young here in Chicago when I read this story? Anjanette Young, of course, had a run-in with the police. Her place was broken into, wrongly broken into. And there were 8 or 10 officers who stormed down her door, handcuffed her while she was naked, and proceeded to humiliate her under the guise of their own righteousness or duty. And of course, it was the wrong house. What we can learn from Jesus in this story is how he engaged with liberation listening, the liberation listening that she was talking about with the book. When the legal experts and the Pharisees brought this woman and placed her in the center and then basically demanded that she be stoned in order to follow the law, Jesus listened deeply. What do you think he was listening for? Knowing how Jesus interacted freely with women, we can't imagine. We can imagine, rather, that he was listening for why she was not allowed to speak. We can imagine he was listening for why they were so eager to kill her, despite the law that says, "Thou shalt not murder." We can imagine he was listening for the absence of any accusation against the man, who, truth be told, could have been raping her. We can imagine he was listening for what they were hoping he would say in order to get him jailed, Jesus. In other words, listening for what was motivating them. We can imagine he was listening for what justice and love would look like joined together. She's referring to how in the book by Otis Moss, justice and love are best joined together. This is a lot to sort through, and I've been stumbling along here to help you sort through it, but deep listening is that way. It takes time and energy and focus. If Jesus had responded with dogma, the 10 Commandments, for example, it might have turned into a day-long argument back and forth about which law was more important. The woman would have been standing in whatever state she was in during the entire ordeal. If Jesus had responded with anger, the entire crowd could have erupted. She might have been trampled or killed in the midst of it, or even been accused as having been the cause of it. If Jesus had simply walked away and not dealt with the seeking of justice without love, the woman would surely have been killed. That's what happens when justice is used as a weapon. When Jesus responded the way he did by addressing the reality that there is no person who lives without missing the mark, without sin, he was able to combine justice and love. Many conservatives have tried to make a lot of the fact that Jesus told her to go and sin no more. My take on that, Reverend Beth's take on that, rather, is, let me get back to this. My take on that sentence is twofold, she says. It's possible it was added later by scribes. Come on. Who thought this encounter needed more punch, or it can be heard in the sense of Jesus being compassionate with her and encouraging her to stay away from whomever could harm her, because we don't know if she was with the man willingly or not. It's hard to say if this was a corrective or a compassionate piece of encouragement. Let's highlight the key elements of the liberation listening in no particular order. First, we listen for who is not present, or who is not speaking, or who is being intentionally silenced. Why? Why aren't they there? Why aren't they speaking up? Why are they being intentionally silenced? And how can we clear space for their voices? Second, we listen for the motivation. What is motivating this person as they say this? When I think back to my early days, Reverend Bess says, of queer advocacies in the church, I remember listening to people say terrible things about queer people and queer allies. It was hard for her to stay focused on what was motivating them, but many of the people she advocated alongside were great at hearing and understanding the motivations and keeping it from being personal unless it was. They could hear the people who were born to rule and followers and who would keep or create a rule over saving a life any day. Rules versus what's best. It took me a while to get there, she says, and I had to pay close attention to people around me who could listen to and for the motivation. The motivation. And then the last quality of liberation, listening, we'll talk about today is one of the more difficult, reflective and critical listening. This is where many of us, and she says herself included, get caught up. We have to listen long enough to be able to hear the big ideas or be able to summarize what someone is saying accurately. But as soon as we hear someone say something we disagree with, particularly if it relates to a justice or sometimes religious issue, we begin forming our argument. We stop listening and we begin preparing. In the state of our current disunion, we have stopped listening to understand. If we are Democrats, why would we want to listen to Republicans when we can think we know what they are about and what they want, which is simply to get richer and leave everyone else behind, or to legislate behavior in Christian and white supremacy? If we are Republicans, why would we want to listen to Democrats when we think we know what they are and what they are about and what they want, which is simply to give handouts to everyone and to tax the rich and to keep the rich from getting richer? Or to let everyone engage in the kind of behavior they want to, no matter the moral cost to the nation or going against the Christian God. You get the idea. Anytime we are polarized, we stop listening for understanding. She says she can justify in her mind by saying, I feel no obligation to understand someone who is anti-black or anti-Jewish or who believes assault rifles should be the national gun, because all of those things are just simply so wrong. But the problem is that people on the other side also believe I am equally wrong. So no one listens to anybody. No one listens to understand. Why would we want to listen to anyone who is supporting Trump for president for 2024? Why would that person want to listen to us rail against Trump? If we're honest, we don't want to. We don't want to understand why. The chasm of difference is just too deep, or so we think. If we skip this part, we can't go to the next part, the 4 A's. The 4 A's are 4 qualities of critical listening. What do we agree with? What is absent? Listening for the isms. What do I aspire to? What do I argue against? This is taught in class called Family, Community, and Policy at Erickson Institute. She said she likes it because we can't use it in a situation. We can also use it as a way to read or, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. She said she liked it because we can use it in a situation. We can also use it as a way to read or watch a movie or a play. We can listen to a sermon in this way. It helps us think through what we have heard or read or seen. In our context, imagine using these guiding questions as we listen to the mayoral or aldermanic debates. Remember, the first step is to listen well enough to be able to reflect on what we are hearing and summarize it, or be able to recount the big ideas. The second step in this process is to go through the 4 A's. Remember, those are agree, absent listening, aspire to, what do I argue against? Go through the 4 A's. It's not unlike what we often talk about in our time for silence. What we do resonate with, which is what do we agree with? What creates dissonance in us, which is what we do argue against. We are simply adding 2 more. What do I aspire to, which is the action piece, and what is absent, which is listening for the systemic exclusion or oppression. Those 2 added pieces are very important. There are several issues in Chicago right now that need our liberation listening. We are hearing much these days about public safety. What do you agree with? What is absent? And who is absent in this conversation? What do you aspire to? What do we aspire to? What do you and what do we argue against? What is being said and by whom and with what motivation? Have we been able to listen well enough to summarize? Have we reflected yet on what we are hearing and the impact it is having on us? We are hearing much from aldermanic and the 2 finalists for mayor. How are we listening in these conversations and debates? In the church world, we are hearing much about the post-pandemic impacts on churches. How are we listening to these conversations? Who is leading them? Who is absent? We continue to hear a variety of perspectives on gun violence and violence prevention. How are we listening, since this is one of our justice priorities? The same is true with immigration. I apologize. Imagination too, but imagine if I'd gotten that right. Okay, the same is true with immigration. How are we listening? We have been fortunate here in this congregation to have people with different life experiences and perspectives on many things. The one thing we have not been successful in doing is drawing or inviting conservative Republicans. I've given this a great deal of thought and have done some reflecting on my own in part. She says, my preaching tends to reflect positions in the form of justice and injustice. I am not one who invites conversation equally from both sides. This is where our liberation listening gets very tricky, she says. She says, I mentioned the early days of queer advocacy. There were some churches who believed it would be okay to express support for queer people by saying they loved the sinner but hated the sin. They were okay with excluding people from leadership and believed that allowing them to be part of the congregation was seeking the middle ground. That does not constitute listening for liberation. As Otis Moss stated so powerfully in his 4th chapter in the book that we're reading, if one side loves but cannot also insist in equality, we are back to superior and inferior, one who is recognized as fully human and one who is less than. We are back to love without justice. Our liberation listening has to insist on what it looks like for liberation to be mutual and insist on equality or equity as necessary for mutual liberation. In the beginning, Reverend Beth's sermon said she mentioned 2 things she did or was involved in that fell short of what could have been. That is what we do throughout our lifetimes, if we are lucky. We enter the fray, we take the risk, we do the thing, and then when we fall short, we learn from it and do it differently the next time. At the end of the chapter on listening for liberation, Pastor Otis Moss writes this: when does it end? When will we discharge our spiritual obligation to listen to others and to question ourselves and our institutions? That day may never come. Even our phones and computers need regular updates. How could beings as miraculously complex as people need less? Our spiritual experience of our world can never be fully explained, written down, completed. At the very end of his life, Howard Thurman, now many decades past the day he sat down and wept at the train station when he was just trying to get a ride, just trying to get to where he could go to make himself better. He gave an interview with the BBC. Thurman said, "Religious experience is dynamic, it's fluid, it's effervescent, it's yeasty. The religious experience goes on experiencing. So whatever creed there is, whatever theology, it's always a little out of date. Our beliefs and our practices, like our proudest institutions, will always be a little out of date. The work of liberation listening never ends." And as Reverend Beth would have wound this up, may it be so. And so we have a couple of announcements. At 12 a.m., the new day has come, a new morning is beginning, and in that morning we shall arise anew. The reality and the hope dancing together. As we continue to walk through this Lenten season, may we do so with open hearts and minds and a willingness to listen critically and reflectively. Let us continue our worship, and let's do joys and concerns. I'd like to open the joys and concerns here with Jack. We all have a joy that he's with us. We all have a joy that Reverend Beth could go with him. We all have a joy that everybody pulled together here to help him out. And we all have a concern. So I can't remember the magic words that she usually says, but let God in our mercy. Yes. Any other joys and concerns? Brought into Illinois Masonic. You want to help
Apparently the ambulance team brought him to Illinois Masonic Hospital. Pastor Beth had to drive her own car because I guess they wouldn't let her ride with him in the ambulance, but she's going to give us an update in hopefully the next 15 to 30 minutes. But the understanding is that he was being brought to Illinois Masonic Hospital for further evaluation, and we hope to have an update shortly after service culminates.
Thank you, Jim. That's a good update here for the interim stage of this. Any other joys and concerns? Rick. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
I have a grandniece. Her name is Bella, and she has a medical condition that doctors can't figure out. She keeps losing blood, and she's had 37 transfusions in the last 12 months and 2 operations in the last 2 months, but doctors can't figure it out. So prayers for her, for Bella.
For Bella, could someone write this down too? I don't have a pen with me. For Bella and Jack, but let's all say it together. God, in your mercy, hold this beloved one. Any more joys and concerns?
I would like to say a prayer for John and I's friend George, who's helping his mom, who had come down and is now recovering from shingles.
George
and his mom.
George and his mom. God, in your mercy, hold these beloved ones. Anyone else? I just want to say again, thank you all for being such a wonderful congregation and so caring. And I'd just like to say, God, in your mercy, hold you all, loved ones. Let's all read together the prayer of Jesus. Our Creator, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day the bread we need. Give bread to those who have none. Let forgiveness flow like a river between us, from each one to each one. And let us not fall into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Now there's a few invitations here, folks. Just take a note in your bulletin. The Lenten Book Study group is going to be here. This is week 3. You don't have to have read the book. You can come in and listen to the discussion. Hopefully some of the sermon will enlighten you and put you right in the mood. Also, Lenten Book Study will continue next week too. And there's choir rehearsal on Monday, 5:45 to 6:45, and the Justice Team meeting on Tuesday. And there's the congregational check. LPPC night at LPCS Fullerton is Saturday. And worship, Cynthia Joho, storytelling in person and YouTube, hospitality. And any other announcements that we should know? Pardon me? Yes. Thank you to my wife who just helped me out. I need all the help I can get. Let's please pass the plate here for the offering. And thank you so much for those who spend their money and spend their time. If they don't have the money to spend, or if they do have the money to spend, thank you so much for offering up your lives and love to the rest of us.
We're going to sing sending song in lieu of apostolic song.
Pardon?
So we're going to have a sending song
Sending song.
in lieu of apostolic. Yeah.
Okay. I'll do the sending song now as we do the offering.
So it's an insert. We never sing this before, so we're going to sing a couple of times, several times. Also, this is it's nice. Maybe sing as a round. If you know what that means, feel free to do so. All right.
Listen to the word that God has spoken. Listen to the one who is close at hand. Listen to the words that began creation. Listen even if you don't understand. Listen to the word that God has spoken. Listen to the one who is close at hand. Listen to the voice that began creation. Listen to your listen to the Lord God. Listen to the word that God has spoken. Listen to the one who is close at hand. Listen to the voice that began creation. Listen to even if you don't understand. Now the vision of the week, let's read it all together. Go out this morning, love yourself, and that means rational and healthy self-interest. You are commanded to do that. That's the length of life. Then follow that. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. You are commanded to do that. That's the breadth of life. And I'm going to take my seat now by letting you know that there's a first and even greater commandment. Love Yahweh your God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength. I think the psychologist would just say, with all thy personality. And when you do that, you've got the breadth of life. And when you get all three of these together, you can walk and never get weary. You can look up and see the morning stars singing together and the community of God shouting for joy. When you get all of these working together in your very life, judgment will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. When you get all the three of these together, the lamb will lie down with the lion. When you get all three of these working together, you will do unto others as they have done unto you. Reverend Beth would say, when you go out this week to the streets and your homes, which is where you belong, think of the rest of us and think of liberation learning and think of how we can pray for Jack and think of how we have a wonderful congregation. Thank you all. Amen. Do you have an update?
I do not have an update, but I was thinking that if anybody knows Jack's family. What's that?
Thank you all, and let's retire into the book room, have some refreshments, and thank you all. Let's listen to the great Chungers Kim take us home.